Welcome to another installment of a user's review of the Canon cinema camera, the XC15. In this review, we're going to be talking about exposure. Now, of all the wonderful things there are about the XC15, in my humble opinion, I'd have to say that exposure may be the crown jewel of the entire camera. We all know that still shooters often shoot in semi-automatic modes all the time. They choose one of the three ways to control exposure, and they choose that one to control, and they let the camera decide where the other two fall in order to get the photograph that they want with the look and the depth of field and so on and so forth. Well, this is professional practice among still shooters. And I mean, there are times obviously that you're going to be shooting in full manual, but very frequently, especially if you're doing walkabout kind of shooting, you're going to be shooting in some kind of semi-automatic mode. Well, Canon seems to have taken these capabilities that give you fantastic exposure in semi-automatic modes and juxtaposed them into the XC15. Now, most cameras, I will admit that when you're shooting in semi-automatic modes, they just look freaking horrible. I've never shoot in an automatic mode. That's the thing I've always heard all my life, until I began shooting the XC10, which was about 2 years ago. And about a month after I got my XC10, finally decided to do it. It took me a year and a half or something like that to decide to actually buy the camera, because there was so much bad press about it at the beginning from people who were ignorant, who had no idea what the camera was about. Finally, I bought it, and about a month after I bought it, I was getting all this results in ways that I've always been told not to shoot, but I liked the result, and I stumbled on a review of a comparison between one of the Sony cameras and the XC10 by Andrew Reid. And many of you may know of Andrew Reid. He runs a website called EOS HD, and he is a cinematographer and a relentless analyst of all kinds of camera equipment. And so I was very anxious to read this review. Let me share with you a few things in that review, and I'll give you a link of that review in the notes below, and maybe even on the screen here if I'm not too lazy. Andrew writes this: the XC10 is also flat out more fun to shoot with than the RX-10 III. It's designed to be used in a semi-auto way. That's really something from a professional filmmaker. It's designed to be used in a semi-auto way, not full manual. This is great for run and gun, which, remember, is the main purpose of the Super 16 style camera. And then follows set to automatic. The XC10 looks more like most cameras do in full manual. Smooth exposure changes at exactly the right moment. No focus shimmering and unexpected jumps. No weird behavior. Well, he says several other things about the camera, but this really jumped out at me because he was affirming essentially what I had been finding in using my XC10 for the month that I had had it. And I kind of felt guilty because I was shooting it in all kinds of ways that you're not supposed to shoot it, and getting this kind of result. And what I found, especially when you're shooting out and about with the XC15, the XC10, is that shooting in full manual is pretty difficult because you only have control of one thing, say the ISO, but the camera's not deciding, the aperture and the shutter speed for you. Your ISO is the only thing you can control, and if you want to change the shutter speed and the aperture, you have to dive into that second menu and go and make your changes and get back. Well, a world of shots could pass by. Instances that were fleeting and never to be repeated could pass by in the time that you're digging in that menu. It's the very thing It's a very kind of encumbrance that makes a camera really practically unusable. So, I mean, imagine what a camera would be like for a still shooter if he's out and about doing a walkabout, doing a spontaneous shooting, and the only thing he had was full manual. How many shots would he get? How good would they get? Plus the fact that even if shots don't come out perfect in terms of exposure or other things, we now as filmmakers have the tools to do an enormous amount of excellent editing of the video or the photographs to make them look just about any way we want to. It's certainly true of the XC15 because its codec, its 4K codec is very robust with 305 megabits a second. Yes, it's 8-bit, but it's 422 8-bit, so it's very, very gradable. It's very, very gradable. So what I'm saying is I'm trying to make a good case for the same thing that Andrew Reid found out in his article and in the use of the XC10, is that the exposure of the camera, the semi-automatic exposure of the camera, is absolutely amazing. The only thing that it lacks that a DSLR would have in terms of the semi-auto exposure is you don't have any exposure compensation. That would really be wonderful because there are times that you might want something special in exposure. But I'll say this, that 95% of the time this camera shoots and hits exposure better than I can, fumbling around in manual and taking a lot of time, losing a lot of shots. Well, what does this mean? What it means is that when you go in to shoot, and you're shooting on the streets or you're doing running gun shooting, you're going to come back with a whole lot more shots than someone who says, I only shoot fully manual. In fact, for me, there are really only two stupid answers for shooting anymore. The first stupid answer is, I only shoot full manual all the time. Everything, right? Or the other stupid answer is, I only shoot autofocus all the time. I only shoot fully auto all the time. We have a lot of capabilities that are automatic in these cameras. The manufacturers have spent enormous amounts of money and time and thought in supplying these automatic features. And what the features do is they do the very thing I was talking about in the beginning. They facilitate your use of the camera to frame and get the shot, get everything just the way you want it, while you're concentrating on the image itself and all that, and you're not back here with the camera fumbling around with it, which I've experienced and I know that everyone else has experienced here. Obviously, Canon is telling you, you have to shoot this camera effectively out and about. You have to shoot this camera in a semi-automatic mode. Now, what semi-automatic mode? My own choice was TV mode, and I'll tell you why. When you're shooting video, you want a consistent shutter speed, because if you have the shutter speed going all over the place, you get some pretty weird looks as far as motion blur and all that. So the one thing I wanted stable was the shutter speed. So I actually shot TV mode because on the wheel, the shutter speed is the one thing that you do have control of. And what did I want to do in controlling it? I wanted to set it at a fixed position of 48 frames a second and keep it there at almost all costs, with the camera deciding the ISO and the aperture. And I've ended up getting great results with that. I do have to make a few decisions, however, on exposure, and here's what I do. I put in bright sunlight, I put a 3-stop ND filter on the end of the camera. Now I could put an ND, a variable ND filter, but I've lost a lot of shots trying to work with variable ND filters, and you get that horrible dark cross, and you get home and you see that and you say, I ruined my video, because I crossed the line and I lose a lot of shots. But if I just use a standard ND filter, fixed 3 stops, that never happens. Well, what happens when the bright sunlight, because we only have f11 aperture, when the bright sunlight is so bright that it's overwhelming the ND filter that you have on the lens and your f11 setting, what happens when your camera starts flashing and saying you're overexposed? Well, I programmed my internal ND filter on this bottom button below the DISP button, and I press it, and then I kick in the other 3-stop ND filter. Now I have 6 stops of ND filter plus f11, and that really covers a whole lot of ground in terms of enabling the camera to get really correct exposure. And I know this sounds very heterodox to those of you who are used to shooting fully manual all the time, everywhere, but you have to try this camera and try the auto exposure feature to see for yourself how amazing it was and how amazing it is. Admittedly, auto exposure is horrible on most everything, but not this camera. This is a very unique thing with this camera. The auto features of exposure, the one push continuous auto, these things are amazing, and they get the camera out of your way so that you can actually think about what you're shooting, and how you're shooting it, and how you're framing it, and how you're leading the subjects. That's worth its weight in gold to me when I'm doing run and gun. Now, of course, in studio, you're going to shoot this guy fully manual, because there you have the time to get all your settings and everything just right, because that's a very controlled situation. So what I'm talking about here is shooting in uncontrolled situations. And for my money, I've never seen a camera that shoots in uncontrolled situations better than this, as long as you have basically adequate light. And for a 1-inch sensor, a Super 16 sensor, it's pretty damn good in light, in low light. In fact, it's amazingly good for a sensor this size. So it's a very impressive camera. Now, if you'll look, I've put some links for some videos that have been shot on the XC10, the XC15, by people who have shot these videos and shot them using semi-automatic modes. So you can judge for yourself. But I'll say this, I'll make a challenge for almost anyone, professional or not professional. If we go out and about and shooting run and gun, and you're shooting fully auto, fully manual all the time, and I'm shooting in my semi-automatic mode, my TV mode, and we have an hour to shoot, I'll guarantee you that I'll come back with two times more, maybe 3 times more shots than you get, and they'll be properly exposed, and they'll be all set up to really edit and make them really look good in my editing system. And that's the value of this camera, is that it is a shot getter. It gets a lot of shots. It gets it in focus, it gets it in exposure, and it gives you wonderful video to work with when you put it in your NLE, so to do the final processing. I don't know how much more you could ask for, except that maybe it was a little better in very low light. But for what this camera can do, I have no reason to complain. I use it as it is, and I seek to get the best results with it as it is. I'm going to leave you with a whole bunch of video that I've shot, and everything you're seeing, in fact everything you've seen in all the videos that I've shot previously in this series, everything you've seen has been shot with this semi-automatic exposure. So you can see that, judge for yourself, and you can also see those links of the people who have shot, and take a look at the results that they've gotten using semi-automatic exposure on the XC15.